McLaren and Norris left the Brazilian Grand Prix as the biggest losers. In tricky weather that needed some smart guessing and understanding of what was happening, Norris not only lost first place at turn 1 but he finished 6th while Verstappen went on to win the race after starting in 7th place. This puts Norris in a spot where he has to catch up to a 62-point lead in the last 3 races that only have 1 sprint race left. So with all of this happening, can we say it's over when it comes to a possible fight for first place? And more importantly, where does McLaren need to get better for next year? It's obvious that the Brazilian Grand Prix has been pretty bad for Norris's chances to win the championship. The British driver saw himself lose the lead to Russell in turn 1, and because of the wet conditions and hard-to-see track, he couldn't get it back again. He also complained about not being fast enough on the main straight as another thing that stopped him from getting his spot back. But while this was happening, his rival Verstappen was making moves at the back and moved up 7 spots in just 1 lap. Of course, this was helped by the fact that Albon didn't start the race and Sainz started from the pit lane and Stroll crashed during the warm-up lap. But still, who would have thought that Norris would finish 6th while Verstappen would, to win the race in conditions where the McLaren driver started on pole while the Dutch driver was back at 17th? Not us, that's for sure. But it's what really happened, and it looks like Norris isn't ready to accept it. In general, one of the most painful moments and probably the season-changing one was the Colapinto crash during safety car time when Norris and Russell pitted and gave the lead to Ocon, who led ahead of Verstappen and Gasly. However, when the red flag was brought out, it meant that these 3 would have a free tire change, and in the restart we saw how focused Verstappen was and how bad of a start Norris had. The Dutch driver managed to get past Ocon without any trouble in turn 1 while Norris locked his front tire and went from 4th place to 7th place in just a couple of turns. If it wasn't for the team telling Piastri to give the position to Norris as he had a 10-second penalty to serve on his own, Norris would have likely finished the race 7th, which would have made his championship hopes take an even bigger hit. Of course, the whole mess with the virtual safety car on Saturday and how it was called right after McLaren's cars switched positions, the penalty that Verstappen got for racing Piastri under virtual safety car conditions, and the late red flag on early Sunday's qualifying from Stroll that ended up getting him kicked out in Q2 are all going in favor of McLaren, being the team that should get the most points out of this weekend. But the 3-time world champion had different plans, and while they were helped by the racing gods because of Colapinto's crash, it's also something that needs to be thought about when you're racing in such conditions. Anything could happen at any moment. Hamilton won his first championship thanks to Glock losing control of the car at the same race and at a very similar place like Colapinto back in 2008. So it's just part of the race that you have to accept. McLaren could have also taken a chance, in a similar way like Red Bull and Alpine, but they chose to pit just like Russell, and the fact that Norris messed up the restart just like he did at the start of the race is what it is. There's no point in calling Verstappen a driver who won thanks to luck and not skill. Just respect the fact that on Sunday, when it mattered the most, the karma and the gods decided to go against you, and that's it. When being asked about what was the hardest thing to deal with during Sunday's race, Norris said the others getting a free pit stop and getting lucky. Furthermore, Norris went on to criticize the rule of the cars being able to change their tires under the red flag conditions, something that has existed for a very long time, but he decided to comment on it probably just because he was on the losing side of things now. When talking about it, he said being able to change the tires under a red flag is a silly rule. Red Bull have taken advantage of it, and that's life. He continued with the statements of Ocon being lucky and labeling his win as nothing to do with talent but the fact that he and his team used a perfect red flag. But also seeing both of the Alpine drivers finishing on the podium, was Norris right to say what he did? Probably yes, because who would have thought that a driver could crash under safety car conditions when everybody's driving slower? But the way that he said it and the disrespect that was in his voice is just way too much to handle, and the fact that he lost so much ground to Verstappen in a weekend that looked like total control for McLaren from early dry practice sessions is probably going to be a very hard thing to swallow for the Woking team, who are entering the last 3 races with 0 to no hopes to compete for the championship. At the very least, many expected that Verstappen would lose an additional 10 to 15 points to Verstappen given the conditions of the track and the passing process being extremely difficult. But in conditions like this, the 3-time world champion showed why he has all of those titles and shows how he handles the pressure from his side from his first championship back in 2021, something that Norris would have to think about if he wants to be a more serious competitor in the future. Of course, McLaren themselves had questionable decisions and strategies in races like Budapest, Canada, Monza, and most recently Brazil, but still the team is still leading the Constructor Championship even though they're just 36 points ahead of Ferrari. Be that as it may, Norris is now closer to losing the second place to Leclerc, as the difference between these two is 24 points while the difference between him and Verstappen is 62 points right now. All Verstappen needs to do 3 weeks from now in Vegas is to finish ahead of Norris, or more exactly to leave that weekend with a 60-point lead. If he does that, it doesn't matter what Norris will do in the remaining 2 races with the sprint event included. He won't be able to get past Verstappen. So to say that a miracle needs to happen for Norris to be a world champion is definitely a real scenario. A couple of DNFs or races outside of the points are very hard to imagine for Verstappen, who will now have a very difficult mission of his own: bring Red Bull back to at least second place in the Constructors' Championship. Because there's a serious problem that they might face if the trend of Perez's bad performance continues. But the situation in McLaren is not supposed to get any better soon, either, as they will have both Piastri and Norris battle it out evenly from 2025 onwards, and we've seen how tough of a competitor Piastri can be when he gets in his zone. Yes, he hasn't been a great help for Norris in his championship quest, because in almost all of the races that Norris finished ahead of Ocon, Piastri finished ahead of Norris, taking points away from his championship total, and the only exception to this was the sprint event in Brazil. The win of Norris here came under strange circumstances as well, switching positions as the car of Hülkenberg was parked at the middle of the second part, and as soon as the McLaren cars switched positions, the virtual safety car was called. Be that as it may, Verstappen has still managed to turn things in his favor, and you know what they say: the lion is the toughest when he's pushed against the wall. But even this lion knows that McLaren has a good teammate that will follow him up and score well to make sure that the Constructors' Championship won't be lost to 2 of their rivals next year. What McLaren are good at is having 2 drivers who are always scoring high points, and while both of them combined have scored less points than Verstappen himself in Brazil, that was not the case for more than 10 weekends. Which is why Red Bull is currently 3rd place in the Constructors' Championship. If they finish here, they would lose a lot of money that would affect the behavior and attitude of the employees, because most of them would see bonuses and salaries being cut just so that the team could make it to the end of the money year. They would have no one else to blame but Perez. And if we look at how the Racing Bulls finished today, 7th and 9th place being extremely close in the 6th place fight with Alpine and Haas, you'd understand that a promotion or even signing of Colapinto would be a better deal than having Perez on the team. The Mexican driver just cannot find a way to work with the car, and that's costing the team a lot, and now they have real options on their table. The cards will definitely be mixed up for 2025, as Marco promised. With all of this in mind, I think the McLaren needs to regroup and look through the whole 2024 season to see where they went wrong, and more importantly, do you think that problems would only get worse from the next season, given the fact that Piastri won't settle for the number 2 driver role? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're interested in Verstappen's response to the harsh FIA's behavior and rules changes, make sure to click on the video that appearing on your screen right now.